Okay. Good evening and welcome to the Culinary Historians of Chicago program. My name is Scott Warner and I'm president of the organization. And tonight we are going to have actually two attorneys speak for us, but don't let that fool you. They are eminent food people, and they're typical food people in that they're attorneys. They've done so many things in their lives, and I'll tell you briefly about that. And and they have such a passion for food, but you'll hear about that right now. Our speakers are Adrian Miller. Adrian, as I've said, is an attorney and a food writer, but not just a food writer. He's a two-time James Beard Award winner. And this is his fourth time speaking before the Culinary Historians of Chicago. I think it was Mae West who said, too much of a good thing can be wonderful, so we can't get enough of him. Adrian's books include Soul Food, The Surprising Story of an American Cuisine, pardon me, One Plate at a Time, The President's Kitchen Cabinet, the story of the African Americans who have fed our first families from the Washingtons to the Obamas, and Black Smoke, African Americans and the United States of Barbecue. And he's here tonight to talk about his most recent book about the Asian Americans who've cooked in the White House. And Adrian has a degree in international relations from Stanford University and a law degree from the Georgetown University Law Center in 1995. He's been he served as a special assistant to President Bill Clinton. He's worked in the White House with his initiative for One America, and he went on to serve as a senior policy analyst for Colorado Governor Bill Ritter. Adrian has been currently the executive director of the Colorado Council of Churches. He's also a certified barbecue judge, and he lives in Denver, Colorado. Now on to Deborah Chang, a former attorney. She graduated from the Napa Valley Culinary School, and she's cooked at a number of San Francisco area restaurants. She's created award-winning recipes, and she's from Detroit, Michigan, and she's a graduate of Stanford University and the Michigan Law School. And again, her career includes being an attorney, a technical executive, and most recently a career counselor. And now I think somebody, a co-author of a book that's, I think, bound to be nominated and maybe win awards. So without further ado, you folks, come on down and grill us up a wonderful tale. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Scott. I'm happy to be with you all once again. And Scott, the only thing I would change about your introduction, at least in terms of me, I don't know about if Deborah feels the same way, is that I'm a recovering attorney. So that's the only thing I would change. Otherwise, thank you so much for that warm welcome. Everyone, I'm excited to be here again and to talk about our latest book. So the way that we're going to structure this talk is there are really two halves to the book. The first half of the book really talks about the history of these African Americans, of these Asian heritage chefs who have cooked for our presidents. And then the second part is the recipes. So what I'm going to do is first talk about the history of these chefs and then transition to Deborah talking about the recipes and the cooks and all of the good stuff that she did. So this is a nice panorama of these presidential chefs. These are a group of Filipino men who served on presidential yachts and also at presidential retreats and in the West Wing of the White House. So this is kind of a great photograph, circa the 1940s, to give you a nice kind of slice of the history that we're going to discuss here and for our book, Cooking to a President's Taste. So I'm, again, the soul food scholar. My tagline is dropping knowledge like hot biscuits, what I will endeavor to do during our time together tonight. If you're on social media, please follow me at Soul Food Scholar on most platforms. So if you love this presentation, please give a brother some love. And Deborah will give you her social media stuff during her presentation. Now, if you hate this presentation, just hold on to that. There's no reason to post. All right. As Scott went through, I've written, this is my fourth book. So the first book was Soul Food, The Surprising Story of an American Cuisine, which is a history of soul food. And then The President's Kitchen Cabinet, which was my book on the history of African American presidential chefs. And so this is really the departure point for this book, because it was while I was researching that book that I came across the book that really lays the foundation for this current book, which I'll talk about in a moment. Also wrote Black Smoke, African Americans, the United States of Barbecue, and then Cooking to the President's Taste is the book that we're going to celebrate tonight. So I was sitting at the University of Denver, my hometown, and was in the special collections section. And in the special collections section, they had a thousands of cookbook collection based on a woman named Margaret Husted, who was an avid cookbook collector, and she had donated a lot of her books to the University of Denver Library. So I was at the time doing research on African American presidential chefs, and I was wondering if, during a search, if I would come up with any chefs. So I just put in presidential cooking, presidential chefs, and I came across this book, authored by a man named Lee Ping Kwan. That's the original book there. And you can see it says, being the reminiscences and recipes of Lee Ping Kwan, ex-president steward on the presidential yacht, USS Mayflower. So this book was published in 1939 and really fell into obscurity by the time that I found this. So I got a copy of the book, opened it, and almost fell out of my seat. The first half of the book is really presidential memoir. And so it's a recounting of Chef Kwan's life up until the point of his presidential service and a little bit after that. And then the rest of the book is about 400 recipes. So I was working on a book on African-American presidential chefs. So I told myself, well, maybe I'll get to this book at some other point, but people need to know this story. And at the time that I was thinking about how to bring this book to a broader audience, there were a lot of reprint cookbooks being published. So my first thought was, hey, just put this out as a reprint for historical value and see what the market is. But by the time I got to the White House Historical Association, who is the publisher for this book, they said, well, number one, we would like to know more about other Asian heritage people who have cooked for our presidents. And then also, we would like to have the recipes updated. So that leads to my wonderful partner, Deborah Chang, because I knew I didn't have enough game to update the recipes myself. And so I reached out to Deborah and asked her to handle the culinary side. And she had the momentous task of taking 400 recipes and whittling it down to about 60 or so and updating those recipes. So you're going to be fascinated when you hear about her journey. So that's really how we get here. So here's a look at the Mayflower. So when I said that he worked on the presidential yacht, some of you may have said, we had a presidential yacht? Well, the reason why this is faded from memory is that President Carter sold the yacht, but we've had a presidential yacht since the days of Lincoln. Now, this is what they call a yacht. So if you were thinking about Gilligan's Island or Lifestyle of the Rich and Famous, that's not the yacht that this is a battle-ready ship. Usually it was an old decommissioned or ready to be decommissioned battleship that they fitted to serve as a part leisure boat and also for the president's security. So this is what the Mayflower looked like in its time. So the first chef that I talk about in the book is Ah Loy. And so he is from China. So he's a Chinese immigrant who basically winds up on the Mayflower in the early 1900s. When I was doing research for this book, there were primarily a group of sources. One is I went through presidential memoirs. I looked through presidential cookbooks just to see if there were recipes credited to someone of Asian heritage. Then I also looked through historical newspapers, and I found a lot of people through that. And then I had to roll up my sleeves, go to the National Archives, and just look through the ship's logs. Every 3 months, and these were called muster rolls, every 3 months, Navy captains have to list who's on the ship, what position they served, and what they did, and then also their nationality. And so that's how I discovered a lot of people. So the earliest ones that I could find were on the USS Mayflower during the time of President William McKinley in 1900. So fast forward to 1905, Aloy is on the ship, and he is on the ship as the chief cook during the time that President Theodore Roosevelt was trying to broker a peace between Russia and Japan. This was known as the Russo-Japanese War. He would later get a Nobel Prize for that. And so Aloy comes to my attention because 20 years later, approximately, when he is retiring, there was a newspaper article that was a retrospective on his career. And so he talked about that. And then through other sources, I confirmed that he was actually on the ship. And I looked at the muster rolls for the Mayflower during that time, and he was definitely on the ship. So he's the first person that I talk about. Overall, we identified 37 people in this book who are of Asian heritage. And the reason why we use that term is because not everyone was an American citizen. Several of these people were nationals, immigrants, who had really come to the Navy in order to get their citizenship. So they saw being naval service as a path to U.S. citizenship, and those that who excelled, evidently they get ultimately they would find their way to the presidential yacht. So that's kind of how they connect to presidential cooking initially. So because we've found so many chefs and we had limited space to tell this story, we took a representational approach. So Aloy is an example of the early people of Asian heritage that we could find on these ships. Another one who starts serving in the mid 1910s is a man named Shiro Tsurasaki. He was from Japan, and he also served on the Mayflower. Now, he was what was called a steward. So a steward is kind of a person who's in charge of provisioning the ship in terms of food, menu planning, serving, meeting the needs of the president or the first family who was ever on the boat. So kind of like a waiter position. So I think of it as a hospitality position. But Shiro Tsurasaki was on the ship from about 1915 to the early 1920s. When he retires from that, serving on the Mayflower, President Warren Harding actually asked him to be on the cruise that he took on the West Coast. If you remember your history books, Warren Harding took this really long journey on the western coast of the United States, went up to Alaska, California, other places, and ultimately died during that voyage. So Shirasaki was serving the president during that time. The other thing that's interesting about him, several things are interesting, is that he was granted citizenship because prior to the kind of anti-Asian sentiment that was rising by the time we get well through the early 1900s on to the early 1920s, he was still given granted citizenship, but then had it revoked. Another interesting thing about him is that when he enlisted in the Navy, people inverted his name. So they were calling him Shirasaki Shiro. So he actually had to go to court to have his name put back to the original way that it was supposed to be. And then after his naval service, he actually opens a restaurant in Upper Marlboro of Maryland and really traded on his recognition as being a Mayflower chef. So I thought that was really cool stories about him. But here's the guy that really lays the foundation for the book. Again, Li Ping Quan. So he was someone who was a master chef even before he got to the United States and in the Navy. As a very young man, he trained under one of China's most famous chefs. So he arrives in the U.S. with a lot of culinary game. But he enlists in the Navy and then works his way up and gets assigned to the Mayflower. So we see him here, different stages of his career. In the middle, much like Shiro Tsurasaki, after his stint working on the Mayflower, he actually opened up a high-end restaurant in New York City. Unfortunately, he opened this restaurant a few months before the great stock market crash. But if you look at the picture here, the one in the middle, you can see that the way that he designed this restaurant is he wanted you to feel like you were on the Mayflower. And so a lot of the menus and food that he was served was inspired from his time on the Mayflower. After that New York restaurant closed, he ends up opening restaurants in Maine, sometimes in a logging town, sometimes in a resort community, but still showed that entrepreneurial zeal. Those restaurants don't last long. He ends up retiring. And then the last we hear of him, at least in the media, is that when Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor happened, he actually wanted to re-enlist. Now, by that time, he was about 60 years old. And the Navy said, hey, thank you, but you're really not, fit for service. But the fact that he loved this country and wanted to re-enlist to fight in World War II, I think speaks a lot to who this guy was. So that is Li Ping Quan. So we talked, those are the yacht chefs. But another kind of interesting story here is the people who cooked on presidential retreats. So here we have a man named Ireneo Esperancilla, who is from the Philippines, and he starts out on the presidential yacht. Now, the Mayflower was decommissioned by Herbert Hoover, so he starts working on what a yacht called the Potomac when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president. So we see him in the middle serving FDR. His career spanned from FDR to Truman and also to Eisenhower. So we see him on your right-hand side with Mamie Eisenhower at Camp David, which originally was called Camp Rapidan after the Rapidan River, but now it then eventually was changed to Camp David when Dwight Eisenhower named it after his grandson. So Ireneo Esperancilla served for a long time. So he is a good representation of these presidential retreat cooks who meant a lot. So even to this day, the U.S. Navy is primarily tasked with serving the presidents when they go on retreats, especially to Camp David. Now, we are grateful for Ireneo Esperancilla's story because he's another guy who served with distinction, but his story was not broadly known. It turned out that he typed up a manuscript for a memoir, but never published it. And his granddaughter, Melinda Dart, found the manuscript, was given the manuscript by her grandmother, Esperancilla's widow. And really, the grandmother expressed that Melinda would be the one to share his story with the broader audience. And so she actually wrote a book called A Glimpse of Greatness, which really gives details about Esperancilla's life. And we're grateful for her for letting us also include Esperancilla's anecdotes and interesting history in our book. Another aspect we explore is that of White House chefs. So those who are cooking in the White House basement kitchen. A lot of people don't know this, but President Dwight D. Eisenhower had a Filipino chef as his head chef in his second term. Now, the reason why I said head chef instead of White House executive chef is the White House executive chef is a title that is created by Jacqueline Kennedy in 1961. So before that, these were called the head presidential cook, the head cook, the first cook. There were various names, but essentially they were the White House executive chef. So the European chef that was working in the White House had Pedro Udo as a meat chef. That was kind of his task in the presidential kitchen. Once the European chefs wanted greener pastures in California, wanted to hang out with Hollywood stars, make more money, Pedro Udo basically gets promoted into that position. He was well known for making cakes, so I'm glad that we got this photo of him making a cake in the White House kitchen. And this photo comes from a beautiful spread that the National Geographic magazine did of the White House kitchen in 1959. Beautiful. So Pedro Udo. Now, one interesting anecdote, Chef Udo got off to a rough start because one of the early dinners that he served to President Eisenhower, he served him a blueberry pie. Evidently, President Eisenhower really loved that blueberry pie and had several slices of it. Well, it turns out that later he got indigestion, which caused a lot of concern because he had already had a heart attack. And so there was always worry about his health. So believe it or not, the fact that he had indigestion made national headlines, and the stock market dropped the next day. Now, fortunately, this was not a stain on Chef Udo's career because it wasn't that the pie was nasty. It's just that it was so good that the president had too much of it. Another example, more contemporary, is this man, Ariel de Guzman. So he, a Filipino, also in the Navy. He goes to work in something called the White House Mess, which is not a political statement. The White House Mess is the name for a dining space in the West Wing of the White House that was created after the Truman renovation of the West Wing. And so it's a dining space for mainly senior presidential officials. So imagine a really clubby dining room where senior officials can go eat. So the Navy runs the culinary operations there. So he works in the White House Mess, and then he gets assigned to work for then Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush. They're together. And then when George Herbert Walker Bush becomes president, de Guzman is brought over back to the White House to help with cooking. But mainly he cooks for the president when he goes to the presidential retreat, Camp David, or when the family would go on vacation. And de Guzman actually ends up working for President Bush for a long time post presidency. In 19 or 2000 and 2000, he came out with his own cookbook, the Bush Family Cookbook, which at that point, other than Li Ping Kwan, was the second cookbook published by someone of Asian heritage who had cooked for our presidents. Both books are great in terms of talking about biography and providing wonderful recipes. Then we have a man named Johnny Pahe. Now, this is interesting because Mr. Pahe was a longtime kind of assistant chef in the White House, but his task was to cook for the residential staff, which would range from 150 to 200 people. And so he was cooking for the staff. And the other interesting thing is he's the son of Irineo Esprancilla. So Melinda Dart's father. And so she is also working on his story and showing the connections between him and his grandfather. So it's kind of interesting to have this intragenerational or intergenerational story of presidential cooks in the White House. And he was so beloved by the residential staff that if you go to the White House today, there's an eating space, dining space, and they call it Pahe's Cafe, just in honor of what he meant cooking for the staff. We also write about other assistant cooks. So this is Susan Lim, who is the daughter of South Korean immigrants, and she actually worked in the White House pastry operations. So she was an assistant pastry chef. So she shared her story and talked about what it was like to work under the legendary White House pastry chef Roland Mesnier, who was there from the Carter administration all the way to George W. Bush. So she shares some of that. So you can see some of his magical displays, like this chocolate bald eagle that was prepared on a certain occasion. So it was great to get her perspective of what it was like to be in the pastry operations. Christetta Comerford, also Filipina, comes to the United States, but she doesn't go through the Navy. She essentially works in hotels and then gets hired to work part-time at the White House. So they have this thing called service by agreement chefs. So based on the occasion, sometimes they need a lot more help than the 4 or 5 people who are working in the White House basement kitchen. So she would get hired by assignment, essentially ad hoc on an ad hoc basis. But she excelled so much that eventually, during the second term of President Clinton, she was brought on to work a full time as an assistant chef. And then, roughly about 10 years later, she was elevated to the White House chef position. She just retired in July of last year, and she was in the position for 19 years. So she was the second longest running executive chef of the White House. The only person who lasted longer by a few months was a guy named Henry Haller, a Swiss-born immigrant who was the executive chef from the Lyndon Johnson administration all the way to the Reagan administration. So it was great to get her perspective, as well as what it was like to be a White House executive chef, to be a working mom, to be a person of faith in that position, knowing that you're heavily scrutinized, but still excelling. So we were grateful to include her story. And then the current White House chef is a guy named Tommy Kerr-Pradditt. He is the son of Thai immigrants. And he, like Chef Comerford, was hired on these service by agreement chefs, but then eventually showed his mettle, showed his stuff, and was brought on to be an assistant chef in the White House. So he got an eyewitness view of Christetta Comerford diligently working as an assistant chef in the White House kitchen, and then getting the White House executive chef position. He's so proud of her and so grateful to work under her and just see and learn from her. But yes, he is the current White House chef. So when she retired last July, he was elevated in that position. He's still there. So we can see that in a way the tradition continues. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Debbie Chang.
Hello, everyone. My name is Debbie Chang. Like Adrian, I used to be a lawyer, and then I eventually went into some startups to do business development and strategy and growth. And then when Adrian reached out to me to do this book, I definitely wanted to do it. So I went to a cooking school called Napa Valley Culinary School in Napa Valley. And those are, I think I went in the 2000s. And so those are pictures of me very young. The top left is catering, and then the bottom left is cooking school with our chef, Chef Barbara Alexander, who was the head chef at the time. One of the things, the first step that I had to do was uh, decipher exactly what Chef Kwan had. And so he had over 400 recipes in this little cookbook. And I thought many of them were very interesting, but I wanted to point out where I started from. So I picked some recipes to feature here. As you can see, they are dated, obviously, being from 100 years ago, in the sense that they use ingredients and combinations that are not usual, that are not typical today, right? So green turtle soup, 5 different color fruit jello, mixed fruit stuffed in bananas, and pimiento stuffed with shrimp. So I thought these were kind of interesting combinations of foods and ingredients, and just very, very reflective of many of the recipes. So these recipes were not included in the book. So I had to pick out which ones I wanted to include, and those would be things that we eat today, and things that we eat today with ingredients that are available today. And so I'm very happy with the 60 or so recipes from Chef Kwan that we included in the book. And so the next step after picking which recipes to include was testing and tasting. And so we went through many rounds of testing and tasting. I enlisted, and this was a very fun part of the project. I enlisted bodies. I needed bodies that could test and that I felt like would be, I guess, for lack of a better word, like good guinea pigs in terms of whether the recipes were doable. So after I picked the recipes that I wanted to test, I wrote them up. I modernized the writing. I did as much instruction as I could. And then I took them to a friend of mine who is from cooking school, from Napa Valley Cooking School, who teaches at a high school. And so I gave them to high school students to test. And so started with muffins and cookies. And they were really, really enthusiastic and provided a lot of helpful feedback. But generally, their purpose was just to see if people could cook, what I wrote up and what I had tested in my own home kitchen. So they tested, Chef Kwan had a lot of baking recipes, which I'll go through in the next couple of slides. But he had a lot of baking recipes, a lot of cakes, a lot of cookies, a lot of breakfast food, a lot of breads and crackers, in addition to savory things. I also have savory recipes like tomato soup that the kids tested. And so they would write them on the recipe sheets, and then I would gather their feedback. Okay. All right. So this is one recipe that made it into the book, pound cake. Everyone eats pound cake. Pound cake has lasted the test of time. And so there are a gazillion recipes for pound cake out there. And I thought, well, I'll test. I'm going to include Chef Kwan's because his was just interesting to me. And so the bottom left corner where is the original recipe, which says London pound cake, but you'll see one of the characteristics of a pound cake is everything is of equal weight. So butter, sugar, flour, egg is of equal weight. And I think he kind of had it like that, but his description is what is like 8 or 9 lines. And so it's very vague. And so, it's like today there's YouTube videos, there's long explanations of recipes online. And so I wanted to expand it out, and I wanted to bring his recipe to life for the modern cook. And one question I had throughout this book was, how much should I change his recipe? I wanted to honor his original intent and the original flavor, but I also needed to modernize it and add more instruction. And so that was one question that I had throughout. One thing which showed how one of the big surprises that Chef Kwan's recipes was how much of a baker he was, and how much like European-based pastry experience he had. And one technique that he uses throughout his baking recipes is he beats egg whites stiff and then adds the egg white mixture into a batter of butter, sugar, egg, and flour. And he uses the egg whites to aerate the batter as opposed to using baking powder or baking soda. And so what using egg whites does is that is what's going to cause the cake to rise. And his sentence, add the vanilla extract with the egg whites, which have been beaten stiff, and mix all together. And that sounds really easy. But for for a home cook, that's like 8 steps, right? Like you got a bunch of bowls. You have to, beat the egg white separately, and then beaten stiff. Well, what exactly does that mean? And then mix all together. The mix all together is something that requires a lot of technique. And so uh, and so I tried to explain it, hopefully successfully, in my the recipe write-up, which is you want to fold in the egg whites with as few strokes and as large strokes as possible. And there are a lot of YouTube videos on how to do this. So in addition to the instruction that I added, we made the judgment to put half a tablespoon of baking powder into the new recipe to make the experience a good one for the home cook. Because just in case you can't figure it out, there's always going to be baking powder that's going to make the thing rise to an acceptable, looking pound cake. And then the other thing that Chef Kwan's recipes says bake in a slow oven for 2 hours. I don't know what slow oven is, so I took a guess, and that was 300. And at 300 degrees, it did take 2 hours for the cake to rise. But there's a picture of the final recipe, and we have many pictures of different tested ones, and it really does depend on technique. So the food stylist has very good pastry technique, so that looked like it rose a lot. With the insurance, it rose a lot. But without the baking powder, it would not, it doesn't rise. It's completely dependent on technique. Filet mignon. So filet mignon is obviously still very popular today, and so that was an easy one to pick out to include in this recipe. And plus, it was President Harding's dish. And so this was an easier one. Generally, the savory recipes were easier to translate. Um, and even though, and this is one that did not require very much alteration, which made me very happy. And so to me, it was really cool to see the same techniques exist today. The one change we did here was instead of placing a long slice of bacon across the top and stick six toothpicks into it and hold it in place, we wrapped it around the fillet because that's how you see it today. But other than that, the general concept of bacon with filet mignon still tastes delicious today in terms of modern taste. Broiling it broiling it is still a technique that we use today. And then finishing it with a butter-based sauce with some acid is also the same thing that we do today. So it was nice to see things that didn't need as much translation. So Chef Kwan started the recipe section with Chinese recipes, and so I wanted to include as many Chinese recipes as I could fit into as I could fit. And so chicken chow mein, Mrs. Coolidge's favorite dish. It looks like it was number 2. And the you can see his original recipe, which is, for 6 pounds of chicken, which makes, for 12 people. So we reduced it to 4 to 6 people. And then you can see him uh, boiling the chicken and things. Um, so I changed it a little bit. But in terms of the meat available today, like you could go to the grocery store, buy a boneless chicken breast and or thighs, and then dice them and then stir fry them. So, instead of, cooking an entire chicken over a slow fire and then, shredding it. Like we don't need to do that. And so that's one great thing that we have today, obviously, with the modern kitchen that he didn't have. The other thing that was notable about this recipe was we have a lot more ingredients available today, especially with vegetables, and Asian vegetables that if you are lucky to live near an Asian market, you can easily get. So his ingredients were limited to the basics, which is water, chestnuts, onion, celery, which we have much better things to use in stir fries and chow mein dishes today, and then 1 pound Chinese beans, and then immediately after that, 3/4 pounds Chinese bean shoots. So I could not figure out what 1 pound Chinese beans meant. And this happened occasionally throughout the recipes. So I had to take a guess. I'm guessing it's like a fava bean or edamame, like a round bean. That's so I sometimes I just had to take my best guess as to what something was. To the extent that you can use fresh ingredients like fresh bean shoots or fresh bamboo shoots, fresh water chestnuts. Um, the better. That really makes a difference in stir fries. And that is what I'm going to guess. Well, actually, I do guess. I mean, I do think that that was his situation, Chef Kwan's situation, which was all of his ingredients were very fresh, whereas we can get canned water chestnuts, canned bamboo shoots. Definitely avoid the cans. But we also have many vegetables like Napa cabbage, mushrooms, tomatoes. I mean, you see all those in today's stir fry. So I made that in the annotations. So Anita Lowe is included here, and if I remember, the next slide is Chef Edward Lee. But we have two state dinners of contemporary chefs. So the recipes are divided into Chef Kwan's recipes and then the contemporary chefs. And Chef Lowe and Chef Lee are contemporary chefs who did state dinners, and we have a couple of recipes from them from the state dinners that they did. And I broke them out because a state dinner is very formal and fancy. But what's great about their recipes is each one of them could stand as a dish in itself. So if you want to make Anita Lowe's bread pudding, you can, without making her, lobster roll she had a very elaborate, appetizer and main course. Chef Lee's butter bean grits and short ribs are included as two separate recipes, whereas he put them as components of a same dinner to go, 1, 2, 3. But both of their recipes are excellent and very eatable today. Masako Morishita, her recipe, I think, is a good example of a fusion recipe. She's got garlic edamame dumplings, and we wanted to include that because they tasted really good and they are an example of a fusion dish. And then that is it.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Deborah and Adrian. That's so much food for thought. It's great. You've done so much research on the White House chefs, and you've covered African American chefs and Asian chefs. Have you uncovered anything about all the other chefs who worked there Is there anything you can say in general about other White House chefs or what their historic contributions were? Just anything you can think of that capsulizes what they were all about.
Yeah, so yeah, I've been intrigued now that I've found this kind of unique angle on the American presidency. So I was looking at Latinx chefs, and there's just not much recorded history. I know that when I was going through the ship's logs from the early years, and I mean the early 1900s, I did notice that there were a few here and there that were enlisted from Puerto Rico. But there's just not, I didn't find anything else in any other sources about them. So I don't know much. And then in terms of contemporary cooks, I'm sure have been some who were service by agreement chefs. And I actually did put a call out because I asked for diverse representation. So I went to my social media and I just didn't get very many people. So the only other person I can think of, and I don't know her name right off the top of my head, but George Herbert Walker Bush had a Latina who was kind of a long time like maid and did some cooking for them. And I know that she taught Chrisetta Camaford and some other people how to make certain, what we would call Tex-Mex dishes. I just can't remember her name, but that's the only person I can think of. So we just haven't had strong representation from other people who weren't from Europe. Now, in terms of European chefs, definitely at the turn of the 20th century, you start to see chefs from Sweden and other parts of Europe who come here as immigrants who get pretty significant positions in the White House kitchen. So other than native-born people, Caucasians or people who are African American and these Asian heritage chefs, you don't see a lot of representation otherwise in terms of what I found.
Um, Working in the White House as chefs, I'm wondering if you know anything about how if they were able to stay away from politics, or did they get swept up in politics, or how do you remain neutral while you're cooking in the White House?
Oh no, I would say they were very good at staying away from politics. I think the thing that tripped them up is sometimes they would make headlines, sometimes inadvertently. Because there would be times when a journalist would ask a White House chef or a steward or somebody involved in the cooking, "Hey, what are you making for the president?" And they would boast about how they're giving the president the very best. And so then, we as Americans, we have this pickle that we've created because we want our presidents to be extraordinary people, but we want them to be a lot like us at the same time. So anytime that we feel like presidents are being elitist, people go off. So it was interesting to see a presidential cook quoted in a newspaper about the very best being served to the president, and then the next day, the White House press secretary or somebody is saying, "Oh no, the president likes plain food, and he's not really fancy and not loving French food too much, that kind of thing." So, but other than that, they're very good at staying away from politics.
Yeah, it seems that way because I've never heard of much controversy from a White House chef, no matter who the president was. So
So, Adrian, I won't look at, there's not much there yet, but I have a question for you because you did work in the White House, and I remember you were toward the end of your career there, you were in one of the more nicer places to dine. Was that one of those mess chefs or mess halls,
Yeah.
or what was your
Yeah, so
experience?
towards the end of my stint with the President Clinton, I rose to the rank of something called special assistant to the president. So there are a limited number of assistant presidents, and then they get deputy assistants, and then their other assistants are called special assistants. So I was in that role. So I had mess privileges. So I actually got to work in that work in the White House, not in the West Wing, but in the old executive office building. And so I could go to the White House mess. One of the proudest moments in my life is I was able to get my parents a seating in the White House mess to have a lunch one time they were visiting me. I don't know what it's like now because, this was 25 years ago, but I can tell you they make a great cheeseburger. Fantastic.
It's an American classic. They should, right?
That's right.
Anne says, can you speak to how the food that is being served in the White House is affected by fine dining restaurants and other trends?
Oh, wow. That's a fantastic question. And Deborah, I'll turn it over to you after I initially answered that to see if you saw trends in just the recipes that you tested. So there was a time I would say that the White House kitchen kind of set trends for the restaurant industry. I'm not so sure that that's the case now. I think it's kind of the other way around. I think the White House chef is always looking for inspiration. And so they might look at to current trends in the restaurants and other things. But I think the best way to think of the White House kitchen is to think of it as the dining space for a boutique hotel. So they have a very special client. And so a lot of the times it's really just dictated by what the first family wants to eat and what their desires are. So if you have a first family that's really wants the latest in food trends, that's what you're going to get. If you have a first family that's like, no, we want homey dishes from Colorado, that's what you're going to get. So it's kind of hard. And also there is a slight veil of secrecy around the White House kitchen. So it's not like there's full transparency. So often we're relying on people in their memoirs and other places to tell us kind of what's going on. But a fantastic question. I think that I think like I would say, but maybe 100 years ago, probably the White House kitchen was more trend setting, and that people in not only restaurants but in their homes were trying to mimic what was being served in the White House. So you saw a lot more of the first family sharing recipes in newspapers, and trying to be the ideal, cook, housewife, whatever in that time. I think we're in a different time now.
Oh, excuse me. I had another question, Adrian and Debbie, if you wanted to comment on this. I was lucky enough to get a tour of the White House, in the back of the White House and the garden, and I got to see the kitchen. But when our group was being brought past the kitchen, I said, when are we going to see the kitchen? They said, you just did. I said, that little room, and I guess Christine Comerford was cooking in there. I almost missed it. It was so small. I said, that can't be the White House kitchen. But any comments from either of you about the size of the White House kitchen or how they managed to do such feasts from that kitchen?
Yeah, let me turn it to Debbie to see if she has any thoughts about trends that she saw in the recipes, and then I'll get back to
Okay.
your question. Yeah. So Debbie, I don't know if you just working with the recipes and looking at Kwan's book and other things, if you saw trends.
Yeah, so I would agree with everything you said, Adrian. The only things I would add are when I looked at Chef Kwan's recipe, I viewed him as the influencer, especially in terms of Chinese food. So like the first 20 pages of the cookbook part were Chinese recipes, and the methods and many of the ingredients and the dishes are still available, are still cooked today. Like the cover of the cookbook is a tri-color pepper steak. And so beef stir fry is very prevalent today. So when I saw his recipes, I viewed him as a type of influencer 100 years ago, because there were not very many Chinese people cooking, and he was obviously cooking the best at an elevated status. For the modern cooks, you could tell they were very restauranty and very influenced by the current trends. Like the way that they cooked is the way that I cooked in cooking school. And so it's like we are influenced by the social media, the internet, the cookbooks that have been published around us, the restaurants that we eat, and you could see all of that actually in all of the modern recipes.
Yeah. And you saw that really in the state dinners, right? That's where you saw that.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so Scott, to your question, yes, the White House kitchen is incredibly small. So historically, the White House basement kitchen, or ground floor, they call it, originally was in the middle of the White House, and then it moved around, and then finally, First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln moved it to the corner, the northwest corner of the ground floor, which is where it's remained to this day. And she moved it there so that there could be more natural light. But yeah, it's incredibly small. I think under 200 square feet, something like that. And so most people, when they do a White House tour that includes the kitchen, they are mystified by the size of it. And so it's for that reason that they have to have these service by agreement chefs, because when they're doing a large dinner, like a state dinner, instead of feeding a family of, 2 or 4, whatever the size of the first family is, and maybe some guests, suddenly you're cooking for 150 sometimes 200, and then there have been some dinners that have been 1,000 people. And so the basement kitchen is too small. And so they have to set up cooking stations outside and in hallways and other places, and they need to get extra help in order to prep that food and feed a crowd that size. So yeah, yeah, a lot of people talk about how small the kitchen is.
Is there anything, Debbie, anything you might want to add about just in general observation about the food of the White House, aside from the Asian chefs? You did mention about restaurant, following what the restaurant trends are, but anything else you observed in addition to about what the Asian cooks have done?
I noticed, I think one question that we get a lot is why did we, like, what do we hope people take away from this book? And one thing, originally, as Adrian said, they were in Chef Kwan's time, they used the being a chef or cooking in the White House as a path to citizenship. And so the status of chefs today is very, very different. And so that's what I'd like about the function of this book, which is, people that were viewed basically as servants were bringing their work out in the forefront in today's elevated status of cooking. And I think that's what happened in the 1990s, early 2000s, like with the with the celebrity chefs, with the Food TV, Food Network, and all those kinds of things. And I'd like kind of bringing history forward and bringing their work into the forefront. And so that's the only thing that I would like to add about the chefs.
Yeah. That,
Great.
Right.
Yeah.
I had unmuted myself because I had people running through. Sorry.
okay.
Annette inquired, there's also a small kitchen in the presidential living quarters. Do you think the presidential families sometimes do their own cooking?
Oh, most definitely. So thank you for that question, Annette. Yes, so on the second floor, and this again goes back to the time of Jacqueline Kennedy, before first families would eat in the one of the big cavernous rooms on the first floor when they were dining. And so First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy wanted a more intimate dining space. And so Margaret Truman's bedroom was turned into a small dining area, and there's also a small kitchen there. So most definitely, first families do some cooking there. Now, it's tricky because the White House culinary staff really get irked when the first family does their own cooking because they consider it a huge honor to do everything for the first family. So there's a little bit of tussle there. But yeah, we definitely have examples of the first family doing their own cooking. Actually, one of the most famous ones is we've had presidents like injure themselves slicing bagels.
Yeah.
So yeah, JFK. I think it might have happened to Ford as well. So yeah, so those are some examples. But I know I've heard anecdotally that sometimes the Obamas would do their own cooking. But yeah, it gets tricky because the chef and the culinary staff want to do everything for the first family. They just want to take everything off their plate because they know that it's a heavy job.
Would random restaurants be utilized for takeout dishes occasionally, or would dishes that a restaurant would serve be recreated in the White House kitchen?
Thanks for that question, Jared. So actually, it's both. So we have examples where the first family would get takeout from a restaurant. And actually, believe it or not, that's the most secure way for the first family to eat outside of the White House. Because if nobody knows where the food is going, it can't be poisoned. So typically, somebody would place the order. They would not say who it's going to. And then the first family would get that food. So one example, and this is pertinent, is the Eisenhowers love chop suey. So there was a restaurant in DC where every Saturday night when the president was in town, he would get chop suey from that restaurant. We also have other first families that have liked fast food. I won't comment on that anymore. And then there actually are, and I think we have one recipe in the book of an example where the George Herbert Walker Bush went to one of those Brazilian rotisserie restaurants in Houston and fell in love with the cheese rolls that they served and asked the White House chef at that time, Ariel de Guzman, to recreate it. So he recreated it, and I believe we have that recipe in our book. So that's one example of that happening. So yeah, this kind of stuff happens all the time. And yeah, another question that's often related to this, people will often ask if the president has an official taster to make sure that the food is not poisoned. And yes, the president does have a taster, and it's usually the president's most vocal critic who gets assigned that task. Just kidding, just playing. The chef is the one who tastes the food before it goes out to the president.
So, it was great that you used those high school students to help with the testing. I
Oh
mean,
yeah, yeah.
that's very inspirational.
It
You know,
it was, and I actually more needed my, Chef Scott Rice, who's my friend from cooking school, and he was a pastry chef and had extensive pastry training, and cooked at Gary Danko, and so Chef Kwan was just so good, and a lot of his baking recipes were so elegant that I just wanted to double check with him. And then the high school student thing came kind of just as a accident. But I thought I needed bodies. I needed, kind of, people that didn't know much about cooking but interested in cooking to test. And then plus, it is history, and so it was a good teaching moment. And then the whole purpose of having culinary programs in high schools is to teach career pathways. And so, you had the recipe testing, cookbook pathway, but also, cooking in a White House pathway as well. So it's fun.
oh yeah, oh yeah. And then, your efforts to interpret recipes with you just have ingredients to work with sometimes.
Yeah, pretty much.
Those are tough because
Yeah.
the older the recipe, the more likely you're going to get the list of her recipes, and it's like, you know how to cook, go
Yeah.
figure it out.
Yeah, yeah.
Have any of the presidents or first ladies' family recipes become intermingled with the official White House recipes?
That is
Go
yeah,
ahead.
but oh, I was just going to say that's a hard question to ask because we just never get information about the official White House recipes. I mean, I've heard that there's a folder with a bunch of recipes, but every time I ask about it, I never get a straight answer. It's like trying to get the X-Files. So I just don't know if there's official recipes, but there are certain ones that do remain popular. So if you go to Henry Holler's cookbook, the guy who served the longest as a White House executive chef, he breaks it down by talking about what he cooked for each administration, and gives some anecdotes to let you know that sometimes those recipes did live on. I think one great example of just a famous recipe was Lyndon Johnson. His family cook, an African-American woman named Zephyr Wright, would make a recipe called the Pedernales River chili, which is the river that runs along the ranch in Central Texas for the Johnsons. Now, it was always publicized as Lady Bird Johnson's recipe, but it was pretty clear that Zephyr Wright was the one cooking it. So when the White House released this recipe, they caused a major scandal because in Texas, chili does not have beans. It is chili con carne, which is chili with, chili peppers with meat, not chili con frijoles. So when this meatless or this beanless chili recipe was released to the nation, people were scandalized because they're used to having chili in their beans. And the White House had to go into spin control and reassure the nation that President Johnson actually liked beans. And so they put down all the beans he likes and the ways that he has them. So I thought that was pretty funny. But
Is that the recipe that's a lot of chopped meat?
yep.
Yep, we made that the last time when you talked about it a few years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, the only reason I can't answer that question is we just don't have an accounting of what the official recipes are. But my suspicions are that there are some house favorites that live on from administration to administration.
Anne says, please tell me that you've seen The Residents and how much of the chef's characteristic storylines are realistic.
All right, so this is so funny because Debbie and I were talking about this a few weeks ago. She's the one who actually brought it to my attention because I'm not a Netflix subscriber. So I have not seen it yet. I don't know. Debbie, have you seen it?
Yeah, I've seen it. Well, I haven't
Okay.
seen the whole thing. But the White House chef character, and then I was laughing, and I videoed a clip of it and texted it to Adrian, and I was like, "Oh my God, have you seen this? This is hilarious." The kitchen in that series is much bigger than the real kitchen, but I thought it was there was one. I think they were fighting over the fact that they couldn't use the um, the hand broiler thing, if I remember. And I thought it was very realistic. Like I thought the cooking was very realistic, and the arguing over the cooking and how insane they get if they can't do what they want to do, was very accurate. So yeah, it was pretty funny. I haven't finished it. I saw the first couple episodes.
Okay, nice.
Okay, there's one person here who has a classic question and they didn't ask it, but I'm going to ask anyway because what the heck? Leftovers. Do you know if they do stuff with leftovers at the White House kitchen? And it's probably not even discussed, maybe. Who knows? Well, probably from the mess, there would be kind
You
of.
know, that's a great question. I don't have an answer to that. I don't know.
That's okay.
I'm gonna have to
That's-
ask.
Jacqueline will be quite keenly interested. I think we have done our job and asked you plenty of questions. Scott, you want to close it down?
I just want to say, Adrian, I looked when I looked at your book. I think I told you that I think at least an award nominee, if not a winner, down the line, because your book, it's about history, it's about human beings, it's about the White House. It's so much more than just a book about food, and the recipes that go along with it. I looked at them. I thought, I want to make these. They look so delicious. So the recipes are the frosting on the cake for this wonderful historic novel here. So thank you both so much for adorning our table with your wonderful work, and hopefully we'll have you a fifth time down the line. So
All right.
keep up your great work, and thank you both.
Thank
Good
you.
Thank you.
Bye.